We're going to begin with Moshe Shokeid, then move on to Peter Gluckman, and Emanuel Marx will close the session. Please.
Marx was loyal to his teachers, those who taught him directly as well as those he knew from a distance. The final chapter in his Order and Rebellion of 1963 is dedicated to Malinowski, field worker and theorist. He opens with a claim that during the 1920s and 1930s, it seemed that Malinowski would be regarded as among the giants who changed the scientific climate of their time, such as Galileo, Newton, Einstein, Darwin, Freud, Marx, and Keynes. But to Gluckman's apparent astonishment, and I quote, "Since the last war, he is hardly mentioned in intellectual discussion. I find it difficult to convey to my own students how important he was when I studied at a South African university, far from his personal influence as a teacher. He seemed to offer a new way of understanding the life of men in society." Then he queries, and I quote, "I often wondered why his reputation, except in narrow academic circles, has lasted so short a time." And a few sentences later, he answers, "I believe it is most of all concerned with what has happened since his time to the study of society." After presenting Malinowski's major contributions, which includes his long stay in one site, his ability to speak the native's language, and observe the whole process of social life in the studied society, Gluckman considers some professional and personal failures that may explain more specifically Malinowski's absence from a list of the greatest scientists. Malinowski failed to produce a theory in the way that Freud did, and although an inspiring teacher, he lacked an important teacher skill, which is to learn from his own students. My turning to Gluckman is triggered by a notion that he, like Malinowski, was erased long ago from a list of relevant figures in anthropological discourse. However, before I explain that observation, I will present some of Gluckman's better-known contributions and my experience with him as teacher, mentor, and friend. And of course, much of it is known. In her book on the work of Evans Pritchard, Mary Douglas starts with a major prerequisite for her project. And I quote, "I realized that a name for his method was missing. A name is a powerful concentrator of ideas." She calls EP's project, and I quote, "a theory of social accountability." One can endow Gluckman with a few names that reflect his major interests and contributions to the theoretical and methodological arsenal of anthropology. For example, conflict and social order, cross-cutting ties, the extended case method, or situational analysis. He concluded, and this is a sentence that I'm going to repeat, "The smaller the area involved, the more numerous the social ties. But as the area narrows, the occasions which breed quarrels between men multiply. In short, cooperation and conflict balanced each other." Marx often expressed his ideas like a missionary, with passionate enthusiasm, and used the opportunity to give sermons when presenting the work of his students. These were performed in the long introductions he wrote as forwards to the publications of their PhD dissertations, or in the lectures he gave at various forums. His 16-page introduction to my first ethnography is typical in length and orientation, and I quote, "I felt that Shokeid also hoped that despite the fact that I had not directly studied Moshavim, I might be able to emphasize from his own study, even more than he was as himself, some general sociological principles." I did not ask Max to write that long forward, nor did I expect his help to reveal some sociological principles imbued in my observations. But this was part of the Manchester tradition of grooming the novices, confirming their membership in the lineage of promising anthropologists, and revealing their scientific contribution above and beyond the standard requirements of a competent dissertation. My observation of frequent quarrels among my subjects, immigrants from the Atlas Mountains and members of a few kin groups, sharing limited farming resources in their settlement in the Israeli Negev, offered Marx an opportunity to prove again his thesis about the basic elements of social conflict, and I quote, "As in a large number of other forms of social groupings, and indeed in the life of individuals, social alignments and individual talents may have opposite effects. On the one hand, they lead to what outsiders may see as antisocial quarreling, often in extreme forms. Yet, on the other hand, they may inspire change and advance." Comparing my research with previous ethnographic studies of Israeli immigrant Moshavim offered Gluckman an opportunity to extol again the virtues of the extended case methods and the benefit of intensive observations in a single fieldwork site, which allow for great intimacy with the intricacies of social relations and the culture of the community. My colleague Shlomo Deshen, who participated in the same research project Max launched in Israel during the 1960s, also had a long forward to his ethnography. Moreover, Max presented his material when he delivered an honorary lecture at McGill University in 1971. He gave me a copy of the typescript of 31 pages for that presentation, most of devoted to the details of one incident Deshen observed in an immigrant town in southern Israel during the national election campaign. Employing a South African Dutch saying that defends the rights of critics, Marx claimed about his students' work, and I quote, "If not a critic, at least a supervisor, can tell when eggs he cannot himself lay are good. And in the case of the work I describe, the eggs are first class and very fresh." I regret that Shlomo couldn't come today. Not surprisingly, Marx opened this presentation, and I quote, "The problem I have decided to focus on is one which arises in all human societies, that of the conflict between community ideals and individual interest, often self-interest." For the sake of that discourse, he devoted about 20 pages to displaying the complexities of the politicians' verbal manipulations and the response of some Middle Eastern immigrants to the symbolic messages given to them. Nevertheless, he conveyed a disagreement with Deshen about a part of his analysis, perhaps gone beyond his data. In closing his presentation, Marx admitted in a mixed conviction and apology that he had dealt with one theme through an election campaign of one party in one town and a compressed description and analysis. But he concluded, and I quote, "In the end, a full study of one situation seemed to me to be more illuminating than devoting less time to it and others." Doubtless, he read his students' dissertations most carefully and left his mark in correcting the grammar and style. He could therefore also quote them as he remembered most details flawlessly. Marx employed that strategy not only with the work of his students who had recently completed their ethnographies, but with his colleagues as well. In an off-print I found in my files, he made similar use of the work of two of his younger but well-established colleagues. In a discussion on the consequence of the Industrial Revolution in Africa, he based his data on Clyde Mitchell's observations of the Kalela dance and Bill Epstein's observations of the emergent social scene in the new urban sites of the copper mines. In his conclusions, Marx encouraged his colleagues and other practitioners to develop a theory of urban social systems. He argued that black Africans are able to differentiate between the norms relevant to their existential position in both the rural and urban environment. In either case, he said that the ethnographer's knowledge, based on close familiarity with the social and cultural life in both the rural and urban situation, is essential for comprehending the dynamics of social behavior and the development of the systems under the circumstances of profound change. That I find difficult to follow the delivery of the detailed descriptions of the social situations Max introduced in the above writings, an inconvenience on my part not present in earlier days, suggests the strength of the changes in the style of ethnographic writing and presentation that have taken place since the heydays of the Manchester School. No doubt, Gluckman was aware of the difficult task of following that type of presentation, as he admitted in his introduction to Epstein's volume, The Craft of Social Anthropology, and I quote, "Heavy demands are indeed made on the reader by this kind of analysis, and I would merely comment that there is no reason why science should be easy reading." Much had already been written about the Manchester School's code of ethnographic work and about the social ambience in the department's Dover Street building. However, the passage of time and the opportunity of my presentation today raise some memories and a perspective missing in my earlier published recollections. As I read some of Gluckman's writing now, I'm astonished to what extent his professional beliefs were repeatedly expressed and done so in a manner much like Moses with the Ten Commandments. That is, that they be emulated by his disciples. The introduction to Epstein, The Craft of Social Anthropology, reads much like a professional manual to be learned by heart. Then he expressed his most provocative conviction, and I quote, "A new technique of observation may virtually create a new discipline, as Leeuwenhoek's improvements of the microscope and later the creation of the radio telescope. The new methodology of the case analysis, he assumes, and I quote, will bring to the monographic analysis some of the penetration which Freud brought to the study of human personality." However, he also acknowledged the convergence of ideas on his theoretical and methodological contribution with other social scientists, Goffman in particular. Gluckman's influence on his students has been remarkable, as evidenced in the work of the participants in the Bernstein project in Israel. Most, if not all, of the 10 ethnographies have dealt with issues of conflict between individuals, between groups of kin, between individual and social institutions, between political parties, between norms, and between vision and reality. Moreover, most participants fulfilled Max's hopes to expand the Manchester School influence beyond Britain. 6 of the 10 members of that cohort returned to Israel after completing their dissertations and set the foundations for anthropological studies in all the Israeli universities. However, my experience in Manchester also revealed the darker side of Gluckman's vision and his efforts of nurturing a cohesive group of anthropologists sharing the same professional interest and methodology. My early days at the department were immersed with seminars when graduate students returned from the field presented their data. Students were also compelled to attend soccer matches ritually. Max came regularly to pick me up for the weekly games that hosted 2 national football clubs, you know, Manchester United and Manchester City. I was amazed to see the big man screaming in support of Manchester United.
He's very intelligent.
At the end at the end of seminars and soccer games, we often went for a pint of beer. Anyhow, I couldn't imagine doing that with my professors in Jerusalem, Eisenstadt in particular. And I'm not mentioning also coming to the Gluckman's home, which was very special, against unusual, very unusual for Israelis at the time. However, around the time of my departure, fission occurred in the Manchester clan when a few leading members of the department, including Max's close colleagues, left to establish a separate department of sociology. That betrayal included Clyde Mitchell and Peter Worsley. One evening, when returning home with Max, driving his car, he told me how deeply hurt he was about this. In retrospect, this is not surprising. Marx even had predicted the development. In his classical Custom and Conflict in Africa, he stated, and I quote again, the smaller the area involved, the more numerous the social ties, but the area narrows the occasions which breed quarrels between men. But as the area narrows, the occasions which breed quarrels between men multiply. With time, I became aware of the undercurrent of bitterness simmering in the department. As benevolent as Marx appeared to be, his authoritative regime, supported by his deputy Emrys Peters, paved the way for the growing resentment among some senior colleagues, as well as for the fierce competition between the junior members. Anyhow, Marx, the master of conflict theory, had written the script for the painful development, also foreseen in his insightful paper, Gossip and Scandal, which ended with the ironic sentence, and I quote, "Indeed, in practice, I find that when I am gossiping about my friends, as well as my enemies, I am deeply conscious of performing a social duty. But that when I hear they gossip viciously about me, I am rightfully filled with righteous indignation." Now, why has Gluckman's stature diminished in anthropological discourse? Don related partly to that. After all, there were, as much as he was resented by some colleagues, he had many admirers. I believe the answer is stated in Gluckman's verdict about the fate of Malinowski, quoted above. It is most of all concerned with what has happened since his time to the study of society. It seems sufficient to indicate the new winds of the critical and reflexive genre in anthropological writings that posit the Manchester works as old colonial ethnographies loaded with true but tiring details in long texts that readers today find difficult to follow, as much as an earlier generation couldn't comfortably grasp Fraser's The Golden Bough and other narratives of that fascinated their predecessors. Gluckman terminology and definitions entered the language of everyday life, but at the same time, his neo-functionalist approach seems to lack the trendy sophistication of present-day anthropological discourse. Moreover, African research had lost the attraction possessed by the leading British anthropologists of his generation. Victor Turner has probably been the only one Gluckman's celebrated student who survived the loss of interest in African anthropology. I'm close to the end. Whatever Gluckman's position in the annals of anthropology today, the Manchester School students of the 1960s and 70s owe him the careers we developed. We mostly left the sites and issues that dominated Marx's anthropological world of territorial groups in traditional and underdeveloped societies and adopted a reflexive orientation demonstrated in the style of writing alien to the Manchester School's situation and analysis genre. Marx appreciated the contributions of earlier generations of anthropologists, even when his generation no longer followed their ideas and methods. Thus, for example, he observed the dismissal of Fraser by those honored with a Fraser lecture, because we now read him for antiquarian interest and often find him dull. However, he concluded, "We are perched on his shoulders, dwarf on a giant." In the same context, he added, both Junod and Van Gennep are outdone by modern analysis, but we advanced in no small measure because of their work. Similarly, I feel like a dwarf perched on Max's shoulders. Thank you.
Well, after all those glittering academic analyses, I'm afraid you've been plunged into the dark. Shalom Geviratai v'Rabotai, Shmi Peter Gluckman, Reshit, Birtzoni lehadot lekulchem, Hayedidim v'Hashutafim shel Avi Hamanoach Max Gluckman, B'nei Dodei HaYisraelim HaYekarim, V'kol Mishtatfei HaKanes, Hanashti shel HaAgoda Anthropologit HaYisraelit. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Peter Gluckman, and first I'd like to thank everyone, the friends and colleagues, and I've met students of my late father, Max Gluckman, my very dear Israeli cousins, and all the participants at this, the annual conference of the Israeli Anthropological Association. I'd like to thank Deborah Golden and Efrat Ben Zaev for inviting me, and I'm representing here my two brothers, John and Tim, who bring you greetings. And also I'd like to say what a pleasure it's been to see again Professor Don Handelman, Professor Bruce Kapferer, Professor Emanuel Marx, and Professor Moshe Shokeid. We're to hear Emanuel in a minute, and also Robert Gordon, who's writing a biography of my late father. And I remember the people you've heard and Emanuel coming back and forward to my house, and I was very pleased to hear a little story from Moshe, which I'll tell you in a minute. This is a photo of my late father at the height of his career and good health. Now, this is a hot water bottle. For Israelis, you probably don't know what this is. What you do is you take the top off, you boil a kettle of water, and then you pour it in, try not to burn yourself on the way. You then screw up the top, and then you run upstairs, put it in your bed, and jump in afterwards so your little toes don't freeze. I will come back to the significance of the hot water bottle later. My parents met skiing, and they met in France, on Mont Brevant, and throughout their lives, they loved and enjoyed physical activity and sport, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. But this is them when they met and fell in love at their first meeting, or very early meeting. Now, Max had tremendous support from Mary, and I'll talk a bit more about the relationship between them. And this is a little note, and for those who, like Moshe and Emanuel and others who work with Max, I'm sure they'll recognize the typewriter text. So it's a note that he sent as assistant anthropologist at the Rhodes Livingston Institute, which you heard about from Bruce. Sends his love to Tassie Mary, Lena Rosalind Gluckman, my mother, fellow of the Institute of Linguists. And my mother was a great linguist, and she became his research assistant for a time and spoke some of the African languages in which he was fluent, even more fluently. Now, here's a picture of Max at the Rhodes Livingston Institute, and he realized when he was in South Africa, we've already heard others talk about the anti-Semitism that was very strong in South Africa, which propelled the rest of the family to become Zionists and move to Israel. He became determined to go to England. And to be a Rhodes Scholar, he realized he had to be a great all-rounder, great at sport, great in academic life. We've heard from Robert Gordon about his political activity on the campus. And he came into conflict with the colonial authorities a number of times, and you've already heard of that from the earlier speakers. like wearing local dress in Zululand. Saroy Walensky, who was the colonial governor of what is now Zambia, Malawi and Nyasaland, came to Max one day. They got on terribly well, although politically they were so violently opposed. And he went to Max and he said, "Max, you can either leave the country by this evening or I'm going to arrest you." And that was one of a number of conflicts that he had. Now, when I was in Zambia, and I was born in Livingston, very close to the Rhodes Livingston Institute, but I left as a very young child. I don't really recall it then. And I went back to work in Zambia in the 1960s. And I went to Mongu, which is the capital of Barotseland, where Max did so much of his work. And I was walking through the village with my translator. I was responsible for the adult literacy campaign, and just after independence. And I passed a group of middle-aged African women sitting in the compound of the Litunga, the king of Barotseland, sitting in a circle talking. And as I passed, the translator said, "Oh, this is the son of Max Gluckman." And they started to applaud. And they said I was the only white child who'd been allowed to play with black children. So we're talking there about the 1940s. And I think that gives you an insight into the kind of household into which I was brought. And I'd like you to look at this. This is Max's, let's see if I can get it, Max's famous Rolleiflex camera. I don't know if you can see it. There we are. That was his famous camera. And I think it's a story that shows about the development of myth. Yeah, the camera belonged to Evans Pritchard. And when he was in Egypt, he'd dropped it in the River Nile. He'd fished it out, but it was broken. And when he got back to Oxford, he gave it to my father and said if he could repair it, he could have it. Now, I heard from a number of people, not from Max, a very different story, that Evans Pritchard had been with Max on the Zambezi, and Evans Pritchard had never been to Zambia, or Northern Rhodesia it was then, that he'd dropped the camera not in the Nile but in the Zambezi, and although it was full of crocodiles, Max had dived in and collected it, and Evans Pritchard had rewarded him with giving this camera. And this story seems to me to bear out Malinowski's comments that myths are not about content, but about boasting and claims for property and land. And when he met Max in Zululand, Max started going on to him about myths, and Malinowski responded, "Never mind the myths, Max, just get on with the boasting." Now, here's a picture of Max and Mary in Livingston in 1941 with their dogs, of which they were very fond. And my mother was a brilliant linguist. She spoke 6 or 7 languages fluently, and now certainly she would have had her own career. And then, like many women, she nevertheless devoted herself to supporting Max's career and was absolutely essential to his success. But that huge intellectual vigour that she had and physical energy went into fighting apartheid and colonialism. Now, here's a picture of Max riding his horse. It was called Paul. This was taken in Livingston in 1942. And Max and Mary were both very good horse riders. And they would often go into the bush with, they described one trip with 26 Africans, mounted Africans on horses, and 20 pack animals with all the horses. And what a splendid, magnificent sight it must have been with this train of horses going off into the bush to do his field work. Now, Max was not only fixated on academic and political things, but he was very keen on sport, and perhaps it's a South African thing, that he really felt that sport was the glue that holds society together. Now, here's a picture of Max with my older brother John. He was born in South Africa. I was born in Zambia. And there's Max with John in 1945. And the time of the Rhodes Living Institute, we've heard the names of John Barnes, Elizabeth Colson, Bill Epstein, Clyde Mitchell, Vic Turner, and Bill Watson. They were all part of my brothers and my upbringing with these people coming and going. And Moshe asked me before the event today, what was it like having all these people coming through into this open house? Because they were very hospitable, my parents. And I said, well, as children, you just assume that what your parents do is completely normal, and we never thought anything more about it. And I remember, for example, Jaap van Velsen very warmly as he played cricket with me. Now, there's John's first memory of this period is that he and Max and Mary were going down the Zambezi on a barge. There were 10 African rowers on each side, so 20 African rowers. And John and Mary were at the back of the barge, and he was in a small chair, and she was feeding him on the chair. And as the barge was going against the stream, so it was going quite slowly, and suddenly John saw a crocodile, a large crocodile, coming up alongside the boat. And Max jumped up, he was a very good shot, grabbed his rifle, bang, he shot this creature through the eyes. It jumped out of the water, was grabbed by the African rowers, they skinned it, and when they emigrated to England, or re-emigrated, this crocodile skin came with us. And it's interesting, you mentioned gossip and scandal, but the gossip got round Manchester that my parents had a large crocodile in the garden. And eventually this story reached the ears of the police, and I remember very well the police knocking on the door and saying they've heard that my parents are keeping a ferocious animal in the garden, and they needed to come and see that it wasn't a danger to the neighbourhood. So they were let in, and there was the crocodile skin, indeed, lying on the lawn. But it shows how gossip can develop over time as it moves from person to person. Now, here's a picture taken in South Africa. You'll see Emanuel, my grandfather. There's Max on the right with my younger brother, and then Max's younger brother, Figgy. And I thought it'd be nice to include this picture because Emanuel Gluckman also set a context within Max and his brothers Colin and Figgy and his sister Joyce were brought up. Emanuel Gluckman was the first white man in 1920 to defend a black man against the colonial administration. And the case was that the British colonial authorities had found that a chief difficult to manage, and so they expropriated his land and inserted a chief who was prepared to collaborate. Now, you probably know that in Botswana, cattle are absolutely essential to somebody's status and wealth, and to deprive of your grazing land was effectively depriving this man of feeding his cattle. And Emanuel defended him, and he had a partial success. He wasn't able to reinstate the chief as the correct chief. The collaborator was put in, but he did get him his right to graze his cattle. Now, many years later, that was in 1920, in 2005, so nearly a century later, I went to Botswana to visit my cousins, Penina Gillon, now Penina Werbner, and Richard Werbner, her husband, and we were going to a party on the first night with the Minister of Justice of Botswana. And I was introduced to him. He said, Peter Gluckman, obviously an African, a Botswanan. And he said, are you any relative of Emanuel Gluckman? And I said, yes, I'm his grandson. And he embraced me and said, we all know in Botswana about Emanuel Gluckman. And I think it shows the context and the support for equality and considering the rights of the underdog that Emanuel brought to his whole family. And we've already had mention earlier about the anti-Semitism in South Africa at the time. Now here is Colin. This is my uncle, my late uncle, and all his three children are here. That's Ilon Gilon, Yael Shiloach, and Kami Gilon. And that's Colin with my younger brother when Colin visited England in the early 1950s. I think that was actually taken in 1950. And Colin went on to be chief attorney of Israel. He was involved in some very important cases that involved the overstepping of the powers, the legitimate powers of the state. And here's a picture of my grandmother, Katie. She was a great Zionist, head of the South African Women's Federation, and came to Israel in the 1950s. Now, while all the rest of the family came to Israel my parents came to England. And this is a picture of the whole of all the passengers in 1947 on the boat going to England from South Africa when they emigrated. And I hope this little pointer will work. If not, I'll point. But that's my mother. And sitting just behind her is John. You just see his little face. And here's Max dressed as the Sheikh of Araby. And that was the crew coming to England in 1947. Now, this is Max at the height of his powers. And one of the things as a family I remember is that my parents had a great love of the countryside. They wanted me and my brothers to love the countryside, to respect farmers and what they do and what they produce, to respect animals. We were expected to go and work with the farmers, to go and milk the cows, to help him round up sheep. But Max could get very angry, and we've already heard about that a bit from Moshe. And as someone who thought that Freud was crucial to the understanding of individuals, of leaders and societies, he himself underwent years of psychoanalysis. And through it, he did manage to control his temper much better. But he did get very angry when he was writing Politics, Law and Ritual. And I remember when he got desperate, he would shout at the dog. And once he was having a very intense discussion with Bill Epstein, who you've heard mentioned a number of times. And Bill was a tiny guy, and Max was very tall. And they had an exchange, and they were shouting at each other. And all about the book, and Max couldn't write, it wasn't flowing, and Bill Epstein was trying to raise some point about he felt offended by something Max had said at some point. Anyway, eventually Bill Epstein rushed out of the room and disappeared, and Max got a box of matches, Gafrurim, and threw them at the wall, and they exploded. Because, of course, we didn't have safety matches in those days. It just shows the power he did. There was rationing after the Second World War in Britain. There were no eggs, there was no meat. The rationing ended in 1951. So we had many chickens and geese that Max and Mary tended. So my brothers and I collected eggs. And we had a goose for special occasions. And maybe it's a South African thing that people, he loved meat. And my mother was very tight or careful with the family budget. But she had an aunt in London, and when she went to visit her, Max was then responsible for cooking. So he'd go down to the butcher and he'd order steaks and chops and sausages, and the local butcher would say, "Ah, Mrs. Gluckman away then, Professor." This is myself on the right and my younger brother and a friend in our family house in our garden. At that time, Max was at the Musée des Hommes in Paris, the Museum of Mankind, and he was with Darrell Ford. And Darrell Ford introduced Max to a woman, and she looked at Max and fainted. And so Max and Darrell got down on their knees to tend to this woman, and when she recovered, she said, "Oh, Max Gluckman, you're so famous, I thought you were dead." Now, Max was very proud of his lawn and his garden. He loved making a good compost heap of old vegetables and lawn mowings. He loved working with his colleagues in the garden, and some enjoyed it, and some, as you've heard from Moshe, some colleagues were very irritated. To Max, he was part of creating an anthropological community, and I'm grateful to Professor Gordon for pointing that out to me when we met a couple of weeks ago in London. He's reading all these old papers of my father's, which have just become available. And it made a lot of sense to me. He actually thought it was good that, as well as being together academically, people actually did practical things together. And he loved it when his colleagues would come and mow the lawn while he was making the compost heap. But some people found it tyrannical. But I think it's much more that he was basically a Boy Scout at heart. Now, some of those that I remember around the family dining table during that time were Emrys Peters, Paul Baxter, Martin Southwold, Richard Werbner, Tom Lupton, Elaine Baldwin, Abner Cohen, Scarlett Epstein, Ronnie Fankenberg, Maya Fortas, Isaac Shapiro, and of course the four who have been talking earlier and going to come. Now here's Max. He was a great sportsman. He was kicking a football. You can see what a tall guy he was. He believed that physical activity and sport were good for people. It was part of his philosophy, becoming an adult, that you were physically active. He was not a militant sportsman, but he did things like sailing, challenging activity, mountain walking, and he felt it was part of becoming an adult to be able to do these things. And my younger brother recalls walking in Scotland, going up Ben Alligan, which is a very difficult, tough mountain, and really struggling to get up. When he got there, he felt he'd learnt something about himself. And it was not only part of his philosophy, but a way of thinking and exploring ideas. One of his most unusual books, The Limits of Naivety, came out of long walks with Eli Devons at the cottage, and I'll come back to the cottage. Now, Moshe mentioned being collected to go to see Manchester United. This is the van with the sliding doors that drove around Manchester collecting people. It was part of a ritual. Max loved Manchester United, and my cousin, Carmi Gillon, who is here, refers to this phenomenon in his memoirs. The Saturday ritual was to, as part of creating an anthropological community, to drive around Manchester collecting people. Some loved it, Vic Turner was one, and some found it very irritating. You cannot imagine it now, as Moshe said, that a professor would gather all his students and his colleagues and take them to a football match. I met years later at a party near my home, long after Max died, a former colonial administrator of Kenya, and he said, Peter Gluckman, is it true your father drove around Manchester collecting his colleagues to see Manchester United? And I realised then, only years later, after Max's death, how strange it was. But Max was, although he was a great supporter of Manchester United, he did also go to see Manchester City, although only to see them lose. Now, Manchester in those days was a great industrial city. There were coal mines, there were factories, there were engineering works, and the Manchester United ground then was 70,000 people, mainly standing, and you'd have this area would be a whole factory, 800 people from one factory. This area would be all the people from the coal mine. The next area would be all the people from the engineering works. So for those people, going to football was part of their identity of working class, trade unionists, gathered together, and this is what they did in Saturday afternoon. And but, oh right, okay. So that was part of it, and he didn't want his colleagues only to be in the library, as we heard with the story about the baby. Here's Max catching a football. This is the cottage. I hope it brings back happy memories to some people here. There was no phone, no water. It came from a hosepipe from a spring. And he loved knots and string, and he constantly used to repair things. And there he is walking on a mountain. He sadly only met one of his grandchildren. That's my youngest grandchild. And here he is with my late wife, my mother, with Dan, my first. Now this is taken after he was had his heart attack and was ill, and here's his death certificate in Israel. He died in Jerusalem. I went with my cousin Yael yesterday to visit his grave and that of her parents at Sanhedria, and I just thought we could take a couple of minutes, all right, Efrat, just to talk about why did he move from being an Africanist to being interested in Israel. And I think there are a number of points along the way. I think the Suez crisis of '56 was a point. It split the department. Max and Emrys supported the action. Vic Turner was against it. In 1960, I came to Israel for the first time. I was 13. I loved it, and I declared I was going to be a Zionist. My parents were terribly surprised. Max was at the time in Papua New Guinea being banned. He came to the family in Israel with us in 1963, the same year that the Bernstein Israel research project was started, initiated at the University of Manchester. In the Six-Day War, he tried to volunteer for the IDF. He wasn't successful. John and I arrived as volunteers, and I lived in Israel for a couple of years in 69 to 71, during which time he came to Israel to supervise the Bernstein project. I think a key element was then in 72, because of his interest in sport, he and Mary went to the Munich Olympics and was there and observed the whole ghastly procedures there. And the 73 Yom Kippur War was another key area where things looked very grim for Israel at a time. And he really thought that the Holocaust was being revisited. So I think all these points moved him to have this fascination with Israel. Now here's a little note, which I hope you won't mind if I just read out, which was sent to Max, and then I'll just wrap up. And this is what he wrote to my mother when they were leaving in 1939 to go to Africa. Darling, my usual gesture, but with more than my usual love. I know that this day begins a very happy, interesting and profitable part of our lives. J'adore, Ngun Yolanda, Jadiba, Tubla, Maya, Chargoya, and soon we shall soon be able to say it to each other in Sokololo. Prosper, my dearest heart, my wife, my love. We are going to enjoy this voyage, and South Africa, and Rhodesia, and all our lives together. I love you with all my being. Bunny, that was her pet name. It is an intimate note, but it shows the key element of Max's life that underpinned his success, his marriage with Mary. And now I'd like just to conclude. Max, I don't want to be sentimental. I recognise his immense energy and huge output, not only in books, articles and lectures, but also the detailed comments he wrote on PhD and after PhD. However, some found him overbearing, especially early in his life. For those who let that wash over them and saw what was underneath, they took a great deal from their relationship with Max. For those whom it irritated, they found him very difficult. He was the first in many areas. A little insight into his character. Max was sailing with John, Panina, my cousin, and me. The yacht sank in a fast-flowing and deep river. We struggled out. Max went to the shore, hired another yacht, and we carried on regardless. I do believe that Max was a truly great man. He was immensely productive. His output was extraordinary. I've got a quote here from my brother. He had a terrific mind and spirit and expressed himself in a marvellous, compelling way, in a truly interesting way. I've tried to tell a few stories that provide some personal insights into Max as a person and as a father to complement what will be well known to you about his academic life and that are being explored today. It has been an honour to speak to you. It is great that in the audience there are people who work with Max. In choosing the title to my presentation, A Bright African Dawn, Long British Days and a Warm Israeli Evening, I wish to link Max's early days and career in southern Africa to his main and brilliant career in Britain, where summer evenings regularly reach 10:30 p.m, and his work in Israel, and here we are on a warm Israeli evening. Although he died while supervising the project in Israel with Emanuel Marx, he was still thoroughly enjoying his career. He was anthropologizing until a few days before his death in Jerusalem, and with Mary at his side. She had been central to his life since they met in 1938. In the evening of his life, it was not so much Hashana Haba'ah B'Yerushalayim, but rather Hashana Hazot B'Yerushalayim. Toda Rabah, and thank you.
Well, I had a paper, but I decided to scrap it because the situation has changed. So what I'm going to talk about is to pull together a few of the items my colleagues have been talking about, and I'll ask myself one simple question, which is, Max considered the Bernstein Israel Research Project as a success story, similar to the Rhodes Livingston Institute in its day. And what I'm asking myself is, what made the Rhodes Livingston Institute so successful, and what are the similarities between the two projects? And the answer I come up with is maybe a bit surprising. There are, I think, 4 major items which make for the success or the failure of such a scheme. In our case, maybe one of the most important things is that we have roots. And the roots consist in 2 different things. First of all, in previous field work in the same field. If you are the first anthropologist to enter a field, you have a real problem. But if you come after a line of previous investigators, like in the case of the Rhodes Livingston Institute, Shapira, Mrs. Hernle, and the American Herskovitz and other people, then you have something to base yourself on. And the other thing is, of course, that you have roots in theoretical work. And in this case, in our case, there was Evans Pritchard, Radcliffe Brown, and Malinowski to measure yourself up against. The principle is that you have to deal with these predecessors. You don't have to accept their views, but at least you have to take them into account, and you have to lead a debate with them, and in the end you can dismiss them or you can build upon them. And this stands in opposition to the present fashion of engaging in a cutting-edge kind of anthropology, an anthropology which begins now and quotes people who have written papers during the last decade and dismisses totally all the work done by previous anthropologists. Now, people who engage in this rootless kind of anthropology forget sometimes that the things they are ignoring now will lead towards themselves being ignored in the future. Within the next 10 years, of course, nobody's going to quote their work because it'll be out of fashion. That is one thing. The other is what Bruce spoke about very wonderfully, in fact. That's the communion of minds. What happened in the Rhodes Livingston Institute and afterwards in the Manchester seminars was that people thought together about their work. And they thought in very supportive terms. They were hacking at each other, but they were not trying to debase each other. They were trying to help each other. Criticism was a constructive one. They wanted to help move things forward. And what was most interesting was that there were no leaders in these discussions. The discussion was totally open, and even Max, who often thought of himself as an autocrat, was totally democratic in these discussions. When he came in with an idea, he did not bring his own idea, but he wanted to present his own reading of the presenter's ideas and help them what he called sharpen the analysis, to move his own argument forward. And the Manchester staff seminars always created this communion of minds where people simply tried to help each other. They were frightening. I remember how afraid I was to face these lions, and I was afraid to be eaten up by them. But in the end, they were terribly supportive. And I remember one particular case where I presented my material about Bedouin herds. And I was telling the seminar that the Bedouin are poor, impoverished, and discriminated against by the state, and so on. And then suddenly Bill Epstein said, "How many animals does a family have?" I said, "Well, it's about 50 goats and sheep and a few camels." He said, "But you're wrong. They're filthy rich, these people. And you have to change your analysis completely." And suddenly it dawned on me that I had been misunderstanding the Bedouin. Until then, I had, for instance, thought that farmers were wealthier on the average than Bedouins. But in fact, it's the other way around. Bedouin produce luxury goods which are sold on urban markets for high prices. So the Bedouin were really the advantaged people and the wealthier people. And this totally changed my whole analysis. Another thing was that people in the Rhodes Livingston Institute were living together. And they, as a result of that, they were abreast all the latest writings of each other. They exchanged ideas, morning, lunch, and evening. And as a result, their work, in a way, became more coordinated than they imagined it to be. Although, of course, everybody had his own theme and his own ethnic group and even his own language. In the end, they turned out to work together and to produce a much more massive body of work than they ever imagined they would be able to do. In the Israeli scheme, we didn't have the luxury of living together, but at least we had every few months a retreat, say 3-4 days, spending together, presenting papers and discussing each other's papers. And in effect, I think we produced the same atmosphere of mutual assistance and a kind of pressure to push to develop our ideas further beyond the present stage. There's always a new stage, a higher development possible, and I think we did manage to develop a few ideas, and of course to settle the doubts we had about our own work. People got a lot of confidence in these seminars. I remember one occasion where Shlomo Deshen, who produced excellent work, decided that his work in a new town wasn't good enough, and he wanted to choose a new subject, a new theme. And he had to be encouraged to realize that his own work was really quite outstanding and was totally innovative. As you probably all remember, he took not a social group or a kibbutz or a moshav as the theme for his analysis, but an election campaign. And the election campaign became, in the hands of Shlomo Deshen, a social event which could be analyzed just like any other thing. The third thing is that we had that both in the Rhodes Livingston Institute and in the Bernstein scheme, publication was treated as a long-term strategy. It wasn't all important to publish or perish. You didn't have to produce a paper every 3 months. You didn't have to publish your papers immediately. You could wait until you felt ready to go into publication. And then, of course, when we did attempt to publish, we often found our work hard to publish, simply because original work is always hard to publish. If you write another variation on an accepted theme, then you are going to be published just like that, straight away. But if you produce anything new, you first of all create enemies, all the people who wrote according to the old mode, and a lot of people aren't going to understand you. For instance, when in the 1980s, nearly 20 years after I published my Bedouin of the Negev, a colleague, whose work I admire very much, his name is Tapper, in London, he wrote me a letter saying that for nearly 20 years he had considered my work on the Bedouin not to be on a nomadic tribe. Why? Because the Bedouin were under military government. They engaged not only in pastoralism but in farming, and they were highly urbanized, and therefore I was not working on a Bedouin, on nomadic peoples. And it took him 20 years to realize that I'd been working, that I'd described a nomadic tribe. And this is the kind of thing that happened to all of us. Now, the real impact, even when you manage to publish, the impact takes about a generation to mature. So you can't expect to be praised for any original work. You have to wait patiently. Maybe you have to wait till a few years after your death in order to be appreciated. On the other hand, this long-term impact helps continuity, which is another important factor in our work. Now, one of the things that Max emphasized throughout his career was that publicity is very important. You have to popularize science. You have to broadcast your data. You have to engage in applied science if possible. Well, in my mind, these things do not help. What does help in the promotion of our discipline is that you try to convince adjacent disciplines to take notice of your research work. And this, incidentally, Max did do in a wonderful way. He had great influence on economists and geographers and political scientists and even philosophers, and the work of anthropologists became quite acceptable in other disciplines. And the fourth important item is the continuity of research. It isn't very important that you study something and publish it, and there you stop. What is more important is that you have students who lead your work in new directions, not students who continue your own interests, but students whom you train to be independent and, if need be, even to fight your work, to contest your work. and to produce something new. I think that in our case we've been blessed with students of Bedouin societies, for instance, who disagree with me completely. And there are now 2 or 3 generations of students of Bedouin society who produce totally different work. And the latest edition is, for instance, a scholar who is interested in deaf people, in a group of deaf Bedouin, and works on the development of language, which is something I would never have thought of, and she's producing wonderful work. And then, of course, you need luck. You need to work in an environment in which universities expand and offer posts. And when you have posts, you can attract good students. In our present climate, where universities are declining year after year, where no new posts are available, then inevitably anthropology is going into what I consider temporary decline. But I have no doubt that this will change in future. Well, I think that's what I want to say.
To thank our speakers. It really was so interesting because something accumulated here from one talk to the other. I had wanted to link our gaze back to history to what is going on now, or just a small celebration. Yoram Bilu won the Israel Prize just a couple of months ago, so I think it's a kind of a continuation from back then to now. And your celebration is our celebration. And Rob Gordon found Emanuel's original thesis from 1963 while he was looking through Gluckman's papers. So he would like to hand it to you.
Actually, when I was in South Africa, I was always introduced as the person who almost made legal history. And the reason why I was introduced as the person who almost made legal history is, in the apartheid regime, I applied to be reclassified as a bushman on the grounds that my lifestyle was one of academic foraging. Needless to say, they turned down my application, but I still continue foraging. And I actually found this in Manchester University. They were giving it away as free books. So I think it's appropriate that you should get it back. It's your copy which you gave to Emrys Peters.
This is wonderful. Thank you very much.